He's the most terrifying serial killer you've never heard of. Haddon Clark has confessed to several murders, but investigators say he could have over 100 victims. At the center of the mayhem, a cellmate of Haddon's that was able to get key evidence into Haddon's murder spree across America because Haddon thought he was Jesus Christ. Born Evil, the Serial Killer and the Savior, an ID true crime event, continues tonight at 9. Watch on ID or stream on Max. Set your DVR.
Hello, Deviant listeners. If you're enjoying the podcast, there are other ways that you can experience the stories that we're telling beyond just the audio. One way, check out our social channels. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram at deviant.podcast. That's the handle for both of them. If you want to go even deeper than that, check out our Patreon by going to deviantpodcast.com. You can see documents, videos, photos, more of the stories that we're telling. Joining our Patreon gives you access to that stuff, really helps you get your hands and mind around some of the stories that we're telling, and the price starts at free. So again, check it out, deviantpodcast.com. This is a story about crime, and it's true. True crime. And because it's that, there are some scenes that may not be suitable for all audiences, including salty language. There is some in this episode. So with all that said, let's get into it.
So, Cleveland, your hometown? You never lived anywhere else?
Of course, I was in the military.
Well, other than the military. I know you were, when you were in the military, you were probably other places. I know you went to Shaw High School. You've mostly always been by yourself, or you never with anybody?
No, I had a girlfriend. We lived together for about a couple of years.
You got any kids, man?
Yes.
You got kids? How many kids you got?
One.
Son?
Daughter.
Son? How old is she?
38 something.
30.
How old are you?
50.
Oh, okay. You don't look like a child that old. 38. She's kind of young, man.
What's her name?
I can say
You're not gonna tell? Okay.
You'll find out probably, but just don't play by, just don't.
You don't want to
get involved.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I understand that.
But she's a nurse. She work at a hospital.
Oh, okay.
You see her quite often? You talk to her?
Just talked to her the other day. She called, we was all talking because my mom was in the hospital.
Okay.
We're often asked, why do people love true crime so much?
There are a ton of reasons. We watch the docs, listen to podcasts like this one, and read all the books about people like Anthony Sowell or Israel Keyes.
But one of the things that binds all of us to these stories and these people is the idea of relatability.
Because at some point, somewhere in their lives, there has to be something normal about people who become so abnormal. At least we think so.
And in the case of Anthony Sowell and so many other stories of killers and criminals, it can be sort of a fool's errand, trying to reconcile one side, Sowell as a military man, a father, even a husband, with the other side, a convicted rapist and killer of 11 women who leaves their remains scattered around his home and property.
And when the normal and relatable becomes the abnormal and criminal, it's rarely a one-time flip of the switch. It's often a smoldering build, just waiting for a match. We're all wired differently. Some of us are wired for good, some of us are wired for bad, but a select few step outside all of society's boundaries. From Cold Open Media, this is Deviant. Anthony Sowell, Part 4.
I'm Andrew Iden, along with my co-host Dan Semitovich, and welcome back to Deviant, where we chase the truth into the dark corners of what humans are capable of.
There's a phrase that's often used that you have to know the past to understand the present. There are stops along the way that make all of us who we are. In the case of Anthony Sowell, there are pieces of the past that help us understand who he's become by the time police walk into his house in October of 2009.
And to be very clear, despite all the missed signs and red flags we've laid out, Anthony Sowell is solely responsible for the murder of 11 women. And his story and who he was begins far earlier than the fall of 2009.
So he has a very interesting backstory that I think explains a lot of what happened here.
You know Chris Schroeder by now. Back in 2009, when all this goes down, he's working in the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. He eventually becomes one of the main prosecutors in the Anthony Sowell legal drama to come.
He was born to a relatively poor family in the east side of Cleveland, 1959. Actually lived in a community called East Cleveland, which is a separate city from the city of Cleveland itself. They were born into a very large house on Page Avenue. It was him, his mother, and his sister. His father was around town, but he wasn't really in the picture. He knew his father, but his father was described at trial as kind of a rolling stone. Had a lot of lady friends around town. It wasn't really in Anthony's life. At some point, when he was very young, his aunt died. His aunt had 7 children. Those 7 children came to live with Anthony, his sister, and his mother in their great big house on Page Avenue.
Court documents say that when he was a student, Anthony is relatively normal. He had a near perfect attendance record. His teachers say he was enthusiastic, an average, unexceptional student. Outside of school, he's living at home with his mother and a number of cousins and siblings.
Anthony's mother, who was already a single parent, was totally overwhelmed dealing with all these other children. It went from 2 kids to 9, and she just wasn't equipped to handle that at all. And she reacted by basically beating these other children when they didn't comply with what she told them to do. She used a lot of corporal punishment. In some ways, that was more common and more accepted back then. We're talking late 60s, early 70s. But she treated her children one way, and she treated these children another. And Anthony, the testimony at trial was that he would watch this happen. He would watch his cousins be tied to a banister and whipped with a belt or whipped with an extension cord and made to stand in a corner for hours at a time. Anthony watched that happen and he internalized it. And I think the message that he internalized from that was that while he and Tressa were important, while their lives mattered, there are other people who live in society whose lives don't matter, who are expendable, that you can do whatever you want to them because they're less than you.
The abuse is prevalent, and allegedly that abuse isn't just at the hands of his mother or his grandmother. It also comes from Sowell himself.
One of his cousins, Leona Davis, testified at trial that he began raping her regularly when he was 12 years old, and she was even younger than that. Obviously, that's a precursor of what was to come in this case, but no 12-year-old child, in my experience, does something like that unless it is either being done to them or is being done to someone else in the home. So there was sexual abuse in this home, certainly, and he learned that at a very, very young age. And by the time he was 12, he was already a rapist. There was conflicting testimony on this point at trial. He claimed to have been abused by an older male relative, but he was very vague about who that person actually was. He didn't even really have a name for that person. I think he just said he was an uncle. It's very unclear, and because it's so far back, there aren't really good records to look some of this stuff up like there would be today. It was very difficult to piece together, and everyone who was in the home was very clear about one thing, which is that his mother never abused him. She treated him like he was the prince of the neighborhood.
Leona Davis also testifies that at one point she tries to set the house on fire and even points a gun at Anthony's mother.
It's difficult to tell how much of this is something that he saw and learned at an early age that he could get away with, and how much of this is based upon things that may have actually happened to him. There wasn't very much evidence at trial to support his claims that it happened to him. There wouldn't necessarily be from something that old, and this is something that's very embarrassing if it happens to you. Not a lot of people want to talk about it. This is very difficult for people to talk about. In the end, we'll never really know all of what happened in that house on Page Avenue. There are some things that we can confirm. Others will always remain question marks.
We wanted to try to understand more about that abuse, the wiring, the long-term effects it has. So we called Dr. Cheryl Arrett. She's a clinical and forensic psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. And she's worked with offenders in both federal and state prisons. And she's helping us decode all of this.
There's something called a warrior gene that's sometimes referred to, that if you have it, you can be prone to being much more aggressive when you get older. But the thing that switches it on is if you experience trauma and abuse, like big trauma and abuse. And that could include either experiencing it yourself or witnessing it. And it's interesting in this case because he says he was directly abused by multiple people. His sisters testified that he wasn't touched and he witnessed them being abused, but that it didn't happen to him. So we have different narratives about what occurred, but regardless of which it is, this is someone who, how can I put this? Most people who are abused growing up, well, not only do kids learn that this is how people can treat each other and this is what I can expect from the world, but it can create a situation where you can see the world in a very black and white way, where either you get this done to you and this is all you can expect and you're going to be powerless and hurt, or you're going to be the one when you get big, you're going to have the power and you're going to be the one to do this to somebody else because you don't want to be the victim anymore. It's a very black and white way of thinking about it. But this is one of the ways that the brain thinks it's defending and protecting itself, but it ends up recreating that cycle of violence from generation to generation. She inflicted a lot of harm on her kids, and you can see the trauma in the sisters in their testimony about trying to navigate and survive and escape that house. I think that this kind of intergenerational trauma where you have that extreme level of abuse tends to get repeated through generations. And a lot of people end up then finding partners who are abusive because that feels normal and end up being victims again. Sometimes you get somebody who ends up repeating these kinds of abusive behaviors.
Sowell describes the home he grows up in as a war, and that war is the backdrop to the relationship with his mother. It's a relationship that has a profound impact on everything to come.
From his earliest years, Anthony Sowell is in a home that's full of abuse. His relatives eventually testify about that. It's mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse.
His mother is at the center of that. For a brief period in 2007, Sowell has a roommate on Imperial Avenue. Here he is talking with police.
Did he ever tell you what happened to his mother?
When she worked at Ford or something, she got off.
His interview with police gives us some more insight into Sowell and about his relationship with his mother.
For the most part, he never really talked about much of his past life.
He hated his mother. I think he hated his mother. He always tried to laugh and joke it off, but no, he hated his mother because of the way she treated him.
How did you meet Anthony Sowell?
From my sister.
Just to be clear here, at one point, Anthony is dating his roommate's sister.
Did he ever talk about where he lived before he went to the joint, anything like that?
You know what? He did say something. He did. East Cleveland.
Uh-huh.
He used to live in East Cleveland.
Okay.
And that's what I know. That's all I know. He never talked about nothing else like that. Did it trip me out when I heard his cousin, somebody on TV, talking about how he used to rape her or some shit every day? But I guess the way his mother raised him, she fucked his head up, man. You know? He couldn't go outside and have friends. His mother gave him baby dolls to play with.
That's what he told you?
Yeah.
Really?
Uh-huh. That's what he said, yeah. He said his mother said, you don't need no friends. She used to give him baby dolls to play with. And then he said I used to put shit on him.
Really?
Yeah. Y'all start to think that he got issues.
This tape can be a little rough at times, so just in case that was hard to hear, his ex-roommate is saying that Anthony's mother said he didn't need friends and gave him baby dolls to play with instead. That's according to Anthony, at least. Here's Sowell, not long after the bodies are found inside his house.
My mother still today never told me she loved me ever in life.
Now,
Because I'm supposed to be a man. But I came to grips with that. Because even though there's no book on how to raise kids, but it was wrong. That's all I can say. It was wrong, but I don't think she was maliciously did. She did the best way she could to raise a man, I guess.
This sounds familiar to Cheryl Arrett, the psychologist we heard from earlier.
There's a saying in my profession, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. The mother-child relationship is very, very significant. And he had a really traumatic childhood. I think everyone in that household did. And this was a family that had a lot of struggles and had a lot of challenges. What we're looking at is being made to feel worthless, feeling dehumanized himself, degraded, and devalued. And it seems to me that he went around and targeted women, because he wasn't doing this with men. He targeted women who he would tell them, nobody's going to miss you, nobody can hear you. He deliberately chose victims that were marginalized and struggling and on the fringes of society in some ways, because he thought that people wouldn't care if they disappeared. And of course, their families cared tremendously, and this mattered very much to the victims themselves and should matter to all of us. But he was looking for people to try to put into them the way that he felt like garbage, I think, by unloading that into them and then destroying them. It's like a magical way of projecting that in and then attacking and destroying that. It's almost a way of attacking and destroying the feeling.
In 1978, Anthony Sowell leaves the abuse on Page Avenue behind. Without a high school diploma, he goes to Parris Island, South Carolina. He joins the United States Marine Corps.
Hey, man, when you come out of the service, I see you in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
Hey, did a re-enlistment or one term? When you come out?
85.
85. My hat's off to you, man. My hat's off to you. You got an honorable discharge. That's a lot. That's saying a lot.
Should have stayed in.
Well, you should have stayed in, whatever. That's still saying a lot. My hat's off to you, man.
According to court documents in his military service record, when he graduates from recruit training, Anthony is immediately made a private first class. He's the only member of his platoon given that promotion. And in the Marine Corps, he works as an electrician. He gets married, has a daughter. He moves around with the Marines. North Carolina, Camp Pendleton, Japan, and the Pacific. But his time in the Marines isn't always smooth sailing. Chris Schroeder.
He's stationed in Okinawa in the early 80s. He has kind of a checkered history in the Marines. He's demoted at one point for conduct unbecoming. I believe he disrespected and cursed out a superior officer. And he also went AWOL at one point.
In 1985, despite the 2 disciplinary marks on his record, that's going AWOL and conduct unbecoming, he manages to leave the Marines with an honorable discharge and a divorce. Here's Sowell's ex-roommate from Imperial Avenue again.
In your opinion, though, what you saw was he was a pretty smart guy, though.
Yeah,
Pretty smooth.
We always talked about the military background and all the shit that he learned. You know what I'm saying?
Have you ever heard or witnessed Soul to show extreme anger or even assault anyone?
No.
You ain't seen him put his hands on nobody?
He always talked about how you could kill a man and all that shit, but you never actually see them in action.
How he could kill a man or would kill a man?
How you could kill a man because of all the shit he learned in the military.
After his 7 years in the Marines, he goes back to where it all started for him. The effect is immediate.
He returned home to the house on Page Avenue in East Cleveland, and he became a crack dealer. Crack was the big thing at that time. So he became a crack dealer. And he did that for about the next 4 or 5 years until 1989 when he raped Melvette Sockwell.
According to police documents, on July 22, 1989, Sowell lures 21-year-old Melvette Sockwell to his home. She's under the impression she's going to be picked up there by a friend. But Anthony has other plans. Once inside, he looks at her before assaulting her and says, "I lied. You can scream all you want. Nobody is home."
After the assault, Melvette manages to escape the house, and when a witness calls 911, they find her on the roof, screaming for help, her hands tied behind her back. Sowell is arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced.
I've read some of your history, not to cut you off and change the subject, and you've been in prison before. How much time did you actually do?
15 years.
You did the whole 15?
Yeah.
Then you got out in when? June
2005.
Those 15 years in prison are pretty uneventful as far as these things go. He's an electrician, cleans the prison yard, earns his GED, and goes to AAA meetings. And then he's released.
So when he gets out of prison in 2005, he's got to register as a sex offender. But there's different tiers of sex offenders. There's a hearing in 2005 to determine what kind of sex offender he's going to be classified as. And at that hearing, there is a report given to the court by an expert who concludes that he is not likely to do something like this again.
According to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, that report says that of 100 offenders with similar criminal histories like Sowell's, only 6 would reoffend. It says, quote, "These estimates do not directly correspond to the recidivism of an individual offender, but to the risk group in which they fall."
The system calculates that there's a 94% chance that an offender with a record like Sowell's won't commit another sexual assault. In this case, as we know, the system gets it wrong.
And because of that report, he's classified as a lower tier sex offender, a sexually oriented offender, which means that he has to register his address with the sheriff's office, but nobody in that neighborhood is given notification that he lives there. So no one in that neighborhood was told that this sex offender was moving into that house and that he had this prior conviction for violently raping a woman for which he did 15 years imprisonment, because there was an expert report saying this probably won't happen again.
It does happen again. It happens to Gladys Wade. It happens to LaTundra Billups. It happens to the woman who flies out of the 3rd floor window. And it happens to the 11 victims of Anthony Sowell on Imperial Avenue. Let's say their names again.
Talacia Fortson, Diane Turner, Janice Webb, Nancy Cobbs, Tanya Carmichael, Tashana Culver, LaShonda Long, Crystal Dozier, Amelda Hunter, Michelle Mason, and Ken Smith.
I lived in the suburbs for probably 20 years, but I was raised in the inner city where, matter of fact, I lived on Imperial. I had a house on Imperial.
Remember Don Laster from previous episodes? He's involved in that incident of the woman falling from Sowell's 3rd-story window. But that's not the first time he lays eyes on Anthony.
Yeah, I knew him. I knew his brother, too. I never thought that he would be what he came out to be, but I knew him. He was just really a scrapper. We call a scrapper the person that goes into abandoned houses and they take the copper and hot water tanks, furnace, and they go sell them, mostly for drugs.
So you knew Sowell. When's the first time you guys kind of came into contact? How did you guys first know each other?
Well, I knew his brother, and his brother and I was on a project together. I'm a contractor. I went to school for engineering and accounting, and I've been in construction all my life. Also, I own several bars in the community. That's how I got to know Sowell, from his brother, him coming down to another bar that I rehabbed for his brother. And I got to lay eyes on him probably 15 years before all this came out. And so I knew of him. And when he moved on my street, Imperial Avenue, I said, oh my God, here come Anthony. He was just a guy that was on drugs and scrapping, taking, and that's all I thought he did. You know, he'd go in abandoned houses. So when I left Imperial, I talked to Sowell and asked him not to go in my house. I got my eye on you, Sowell, and that's basically how I knew him, and I kept my eye on him. He would wave and speak to me.
In your interactions with him, I mean, aside from saying, hey, I got my eyes on you.
Nothing. Never had really a long conversation with him. He'd nod at me sometimes, and I'd nod back. I would see him on his mission. We call that when you're going to get your drug, you hit a lick, and he on his mission to go back to the house and get high. I would see him with females sometimes, but nothing out of the ordinary.
In the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, Anthony Sowell is a familiar face. People know him, and he knows them. Everything we've learned about him so far shows his deep contempt for not only his mother, but for the women in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, too. Here's his ex-roommate again.
Can you remember him knowing or being in company with any other victims of this Imperial Avenue?
I didn't know none of them girls.
None of them. You can't remember him knowing, him saying he knew any of them or he know any of them or anything like that?
No, sometimes, we was getting half some. He was always looking at that back window in the kitchen.
Okay.
And he would always say, Jay, come and check her out. She's flying a motherfucker. Yeah, she is.
You never saw any of these women at the house?
None of these women.
Just taking a look at them closer. Like in a conversation, you might as well say, that bitch, what's her name, was over here. Or that bitch asked me for this or something like that. Did he say anything about it?
He didn't talk to me about these women. All he ever talked about to me was, he talked about how fine the bitches was that was out there tricking, and that was pretty much it.
Sowell himself is happy to talk about this part of things.
You had to teach them a lot. You had to punish.
They use all the kids today. Don't give a fuck about. What about your kids? Why ain't you with your kids? You'd rather be doing this than this mean more than your kids, y'all mothers, women, like I said, fathers, yeah.
Chris Schroeder.
He's asked about why he did what he did in his statement, and he says that he selected women who reminded him of his ex-girlfriend. After her mother died in 2007, she got clean of drugs, and he wanted to keep using drugs, and his addiction eventually disgusted her, and she had to get away from that lifestyle, so she broke up with him. That enraged him, embittered him, and filled him with this psychotic hatred of women.
You know what, Tom? Let's talk about the first time your anger got a hold of you.
When I don't know if it's anger like that.
Rage?
No, I can't explain. Hate. If you treat somebody good, then it'll be like telling me shit.
When did you first lose control of this anger?
After me and my girlfriend broke up, I guess.
What was your head telling you, Tom?
People don't give a fuck about nothing, nobody. Even when you help them, do everything for them. I don't know what happened. But I know it had something to do with my last girlfriend.
So when you broke up with your last girlfriend, that's when this started, huh?
Yep.
You want some more now? Hey, creamy sugar.
Let me tell you a story about her. Crackhead. But I loved her. And I helped her. I used to go out the streets look for her because I would be worried. I had a phone, put it out. I really know it happened to me before I had a cell phone. So she could always call. I said, at least this call let me know you're all right. I said, why don't you let me get you some help? I said, I'll be there for you. I'll come visit you. I'll help you.
Your girlfriend's not one of the people we found. Right?
No. She's works right downtown.
Oh, yeah.
Right downtown. I love her. I know.
But at that point, you feel when you weren't able to control your hate or your anger or whatever.
That's when I just started hearing things, yeah. It was just, I just like had a breakdown or something.
And in his interview, he talks about dividing the women that he met on the street into good ones and bad ones. And the good ones were the ones who were going to school, who had jobs, who were taking care of their kids, things that women were supposed to do in his mind. And the bad ones were the ones who were just out using drugs while they had kids at home.
So the bad ones are the ones that remind you of your girlfriend.
Yeah.
And the ones that's doing the drugs and got kids and families at home. That's what the bad ones are.
I think so, mostly, yeah.
Are any of the good ones people that get high and have kids at home, but they're not in the street? They just
Yeah, they can.
But if they're out here in the street just doing drugs and got kids at home and soliciting, trying to scam or whatever, those are bad ones. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah.
And he says very clearly in that interview, they reminded me of my girl. And those are the ones that he killed.
Why would you hurt them with your hands? Could you tell me that?
Oh,
Did they say something to you or piss you off some kind of way?
reminded me of my girl. That's the best I did.
Something that they did because they were all cool with you, right?
That's that would be cool. I was just talking to him.
Well, at the time you met them and
it was like everything was cool. Like
Yeah.
she was spending the night or something. And I wake up and I'll be like, damn, where you go? Or damn, I was drunk and fucked up for 2 days or something like that.
Like they disappeared on.
Right.
So he selected his victims based upon a kind of warped vigilante justice against women that he felt were bad, that were using drugs when they had kids at home.
I think that it's somewhat ironic that he viewed himself as like a punisher.
Dr. Cheryl Arrett.
I think one of the kind of superficial justifications for this was that these women shouldn't be out there living the lifestyle they are, and he's going to punish them for perceived transgressions. But a lot of times the sexual assaults can be crimes of opportunity, and certainly expressions of the hatred toward women and wanting to punish and inflict suffering on them. But he's positioning himself as a sort of savior vigilante kind of character, as sort of like the hero of his own narrative. And it both idealizes him in his own mind and also justifies him behaving in definitely not a good guy. The lack of guilt, the lack of concern, the way that certainly when we look at the way that he interacted, not just with the women who he attacked and killed, but also with people who tried to intervene on their behalf. This was a predator. This was somebody who was looking at these women not as humans, but as beings to be able to do what he wanted to do. And I don't think that he was killing necessarily because he was so full of rage and trying to get it out. I think that this was a real predatory conquest, kind of enacting and reenacting something.
The shaping of Anthony Sowell is a complex mix. And as we said in the beginning, the responsibility for what he did, the vicious murder of 11 women in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, rests solely at his feet. But it's important to consider that mix and that house, that he describes as a war, had some bearing on who he becomes. And that's a predator, a serial killer, a man the media would call the Cleveland Strangler.
Next time on Deviant.
Good afternoon, Anthony.
Good afternoon.
I need you to keep your voice up so all the jurors can hear you. Let's just start by having you give the jury your full name.
Anthony Edward Sowell.
And what's your birth date, Anthony?
August 19, 1959.
And how old are you right now?
51.
Anthony Sowell stands trial, and we'll hear testimony that shakes a city.
I remember just the tension in the courtroom being unbearable. Like knowing that was coming, that this horrible thing is about to come out, and everyone in the courtroom is going to hear it, and they'll never be able to unhear it.
Until then, thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out our socials on Instagram and TikTok at deviant.podcast and our Patreon at deviantpodcast.com. There's a lot of stuff in both those places that will show you more of what we're talking about in these shows.
Deviant is written, produced, and executive produced by Clark Goldband, Dan Semitovich, and me, Andrew Iden. Editorial and production consultation comes from Jenny Ament, with original scoring from Shuvo Sir. Marketing, sales, and distribution support come from our partners at Gemini 13. Deviant is a production of Cold Open Media.